Marcus Johnson stood frozen, a pair of silver tongs clutched in one hand, a perfectly grilled rib in the other, his face twisted in a mix of confusion and amusement. His backyard, alive with the chatter of family and friends, the sizzle of meat on the grill, and the smell of his famous hickory-smoked ribs, was suddenly thrown into a bizarre moment of silence. Across the street, standing on her porch like some self-appointed sheriff of the Homeowners Association, was Karen Simmons, phone pressed tightly against her ear, her lips moving furiously. Marcus squinted. Was she calling the cops? The music played on, the aroma of barbecue thick in the warm summer air, but something about the way Karen's eyes darted back and forth, her posture stiff with righteous indignation, sent a ripple through the gathering. People exchanged looks, some shaking their heads, others chuckling under their breath. They all knew Karen. She was the kind of woman who thought putting up a neighborhood watch sign on her lawn made her a law enforcement officer. The kind who complained about Halloween decorations being too scary for the children, and reported a lemonade stand for not having a business permit. Marcus sighed. He should have known this was coming. The moment he fired up the grill and turned on his old-school R&B playlist, Karen had appeared on her front porch like a moth drawn to a flame. It had only been a matter of time before she found something to clutch her pearls over. Maybe it was the fact that people were laughing too loudly. Maybe it was the kids playing tag on the sidewalk. Or maybe, just maybe, it was that she had never quite been comfortable with a black family being the life of the neighborhood. "Yo, Marcus," called his cousin Derek, leaning against the cooler. "You see this? Karen's about to pull a full-on, I'd like to speak to the manager moment with the police." Marcus shook his head, setting the tongs down. "Man, I don't even know what she's complaining about this time." "Probably the chicken," Derek smirked. "She saw that seasoning and got scared." Laughter rippled through the group, but beneath it was a familiar tension. Because they all knew what this could turn into. A black family having a good time, minding their business, and suddenly the police were involved. It was a script they'd seen too many times before, and it rarely had a happy ending. Marcus, always the one to keep things light, felt his jaw tighten. He loved this neighborhood. He had worked hard to buy this house, to create a home where his kids could grow up feeling safe. But safe didn't always mean the same thing for everyone. Meanwhile, Karen stood on her porch, voice rising, gesturing wildly. "Yes. It's very loud. I don't know what they're doing, but it's extremely disruptive." From across the lawn, Marcus' wife, Lisa, muttered under her breath. "She acts like we're running an underground nightclub." Their 10-year-old son, Jaden, tugged at Lisa's shirt. "Is the lady mad again?" Lisa forced a smile, ruffling his curls. "She's just confused, baby." Across the yard, the guests were reacting in their own ways. Marcus' auntie, always quick with her sharp tongue, was already shaking her head. "Lord, I knew she was gonna do this. I could feel it in my spirit when I saw her staring out the window like she was auditioning for Rear Window." Marcus exhaled. He wanted to ignore it. He wanted to keep flipping ribs, laughing with his people, and enjoying the day. But the weight of it sat on his shoulders. He glanced at his best friend, Officer Rick Richardson, who, at that very moment, was sitting in a lawn chair, beer in hand, barbecue sauce on his chin, looking completely at home. Rick was more than just a police officer. He was the police chief. Marcus' lips twitched. Karen had no idea. Rick, sensing Marcus' stare, raised an eyebrow. "What?" Marcus tilted his head toward Karen. "She called the cops." Rick blinked. "On who?" "On us." Rick stared for a beat before bursting into laughter so loud, several guests turned to look. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, shaking his head. "Oh man. She done messed up." The realization sent a slow, amused ripple through the crowd. Some of them, initially tense at the idea of police involvement, began to relax, their laughter bubbling up. The irony was too rich. Karen had made this call, expecting some rookie officers to show up and harass the Johnsons. Instead, the man she was trying to sick the cops on was the cop. Karen, still on the phone, hadn't noticed. Yes. Send someone right away. I don't feel safe. Marcus groaned. He knew exactly what she was doing. Using the coded language that had historically led to terrible outcomes for black families like his. But what Karen didn't know was that this time, the system she thought was working in her favor had just thrown her the biggest curveball of her life. Across town, a police dispatcher, already weary of Karen's frequent calls, glanced at the report and hesitated. Chief. Rick's radio, sitting on the table beside him, crackled to life. The entire backyard went quiet as the voice came through. We got a noise complaint at your location? Rick picked up the radio, still grinning. Yeah, I got this one. Marcus could hardly keep a straight face. Karen, still standing stiffly on her porch, still completely oblivious, was in for the shock of her life. The tension had turned into something entirely different now, a collective, electric anticipation. Derek leaned in. Bro. I hope she's ready for what's coming. Marcus just smiled, grabbing another rib. Oh, she ain't ready at all. The dispatcher on the other end of the radio hesitated for a moment, trying to process what was happening. It wasn't every day that a noise complaint came in about a house where the police chief himself was enjoying a barbecue. The absurdity of the situation was not lost on her. After a brief pause, she let out a tired sigh and responded, Chief, do you want me to still send a unit? Rick, still lounging in his chair, wiped his hands with a napkin, taking his time before responding. He glanced over at Marcus, who was watching with a knowing smirk, and then at Karen, who was now pacing on her porch like she was preparing legal documents for an imaginary court case. The backyard, which had tensed up at the mention of police, was now shifting into something entirely different. People were on edge, but this time, it was in anticipation of Karen's inevitable realization. Rick clicked his radio. Yeah, send a couple of guys. Let's make it official. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Oh, you gonna play this one out? Rick grinned. Oh, absolutely. She wants to call the cops? Let's give her the full experience. The guests started murmuring among themselves, some whispering jokes, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The tension had morphed into amusement, but there was still an underlying frustration. Because the truth was, Karen's call wasn't just ridiculous, it was dangerous. Had Rick not been here, had the responding officers been ones who assumed the worst, this could have played out very differently. Meanwhile, Karen was still completely in the dark. Yes, officer, it's getting worse. Now they're just standing around like they're planning something. Lisa, holding back a laugh, whispered to Marcus, planning what? Dessert. The guests chuckled, but there was a sharp edge to it. They had all seen what happened in the news. A simple call could escalate. A situation that started as suspicious activity could end with someone being tackled to the ground, or worse. That was the weight of living in a world where the wrong assumptions could be deadly. Rick, still grinning, leaned back in his chair. I'll give it 5 minutes before she realizes what's about to happen. Across town, the 2 rookie officers responding to the call were speeding toward the location, completely unaware of what awaited them. Officer Jenkins, fresh out of training, was gripping the steering wheel like it was his lifeline. So, what's the call again? His partner, Officer Diaz, skimmed the report on the screen. Noise complaint. Possible disturbance. Complainant seems pretty shaken up. Jenkins sighed. Man, I hate these calls. It's always some neighborhood drama. Diaz chuckled. You'll get used to it. Usually, it's just someone upset that their neighbor's grass is 2 inches taller than HOA standards. Jenkins nodded but couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the fact that the dispatcher had sounded hesitant. Maybe it was the odd phrasing of the report. But he pushed the thought aside as they turned onto the street. As they pulled up, Karen, seeing the squad car, practically jumped off her porch, waving frantically. Officers! Officers! Thank God you're here. Jenkins stepped out, his hand resting on his belt. Ma'am, you reported a disturbance? Yes. It's been awful. They've been making all this noise, blocking the street, and I think they might be drinking outside." She whispered that last part as if she had just revealed a national security breach. Diaz raised an eyebrow. "Drinking outside?" "Yes. And there are so many of them. It's out of control." Jenkins, sighing internally, turned his gaze toward the so-called disturbance. The first thing he saw was a backyard full of people, laughing, eating, and enjoying themselves. The second thing he saw was the man sitting in the lawn chair, who looked vaguely familiar. It took him a second before it clicked. Oh no. Diaz, confused, followed his gaze. "Wait, is that?" Rick, watching the realization dawn on the officers, gave them a small wave, grinning like a man who knew this moment would be talked about for years. Jenkins suddenly wished he had called in sick. He could already hear the lecture he was about to receive. The man they had just been sent to investigate was literally their boss. Karen, oblivious, kept ranting. "And they've been using all kinds of loud language. I heard one of them say yo at least 5 times. I don't know what that means, but I don't like it." Jenkins turned to look at her, his brain short-circuiting. "Ma'am, did you just call us on the police chief's house?" Karen blinked. "What?" Diaz rubbed his temples. "That man, the one sitting in the chair, that's Chief Richardson." Karen stared, then laughed. No, that's not possible." Rick finally stood up, wiping his hands on a napkin before strolling over. "Oh, it's very possible." Karen's face drained of color as she took a step back. "Wait, you're—" Rick gave her a polite, almost smug smile. "That's right, ma'am. And you just wasted police resources because you're mad about a barbecue." Karen's mouth opened and closed, her brain scrambling for a way to turn this in her favor. Well, I didn't know you were here. If I had known, I wouldn't have called. I was just worried about the neighborhood." Rick tilted his head. "Were you? Or were you just uncomfortable seeing a group of black folks enjoying their afternoon?" Karen gasped, deeply offended. "How dare you accuse me of—" Marcus, finally stepping forward, crossed his arms. "Lady, you called the cops on a family barbecue. What exactly did you think was going to happen?" Karen sputtered, looking around for support, but all she saw were amused, unimpressed, and downright irritated faces. Even Jenkins and Diaz were shaking their heads, trying to figure out how they had ended up in this mess. Rick sighed, turning back to his officers. "All right, since we're here, let's make this official. Jenkins, Diaz, do you see any crime happening here?" Jenkins cleared his throat. No, sir." Diaz smirked. "Just a crime against good judgment." Laughter rippled through the crowd, and Karen's face turned an impossible shade of red. She opened her mouth to protest, but Rick held up a hand. "Karen, let me give you some advice. You call the police when there's an actual emergency. Not when you're just uncomfortable. Do it again, and I'll have you charged for making a false report. Are we clear?" Karen, looking like she had just swallowed a lemon whole, nodded stiffly. Rick clapped his hands. "Great. Now, if you'll excuse me, I was in the middle of a plate of ribs." With that, he turned and walked back toward the barbecue, the officers trailing behind him, shaking their heads. The backyard erupted in laughter, but beneath it all, there was a lesson that everyone, especially Karen, would not forget anytime soon. Karen stood motionless, her face frozen in shock as the reality of the situation sank in. The laughter from the backyard hit her like a wave, each chuckle, each smirk, each knowing glance making her stomach twist. She had called the cops to break up a disturbance, and instead, she had walked right into her own disaster. It was as if the entire universe had turned against her in the most humiliating way possible. The police chief himself had been sitting at the very barbecue she had tried to shut down. Her eyes darted from one face to another, searching for someone, anyone, who might be on her side. But even Officer Jenkins and Officer Diaz, the very people she had summoned, looked at her like she had just set her own house on fire. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, But Karen wasn't one to admit defeat so easily. She straightened her spine, cleared her throat, and forced a smile, as if she could somehow twist this into something salvageable. I was just trying to look out for the community," she stammered, her voice unsteady but still dripping with the same misplaced confidence that had gotten her into this mess. "I mean, with all the crime going around these days, I thought it was important to make sure everything was under control." Marcus, who had been watching with a mix of amusement and disbelief, took a slow sip of his lemonade before speaking. "Karen, let me get this straight. You saw a family, grilling in their own backyard, having a good time, and your first instinct was to call the police." Karen opened her mouth but hesitated. She wanted to say yes, that it was about safety, that she had no problem with them, that it wasn't about race, but the words stuck in her throat. Because no matter how she spun it, no matter what excuse she came up with, the truth was standing in front of her, smirking over a plate of ribs. Rick crossed his arms, tilting his head slightly. "Karen, do you even hear yourself right now?" Karen's face twitched. She was losing control of the narrative, and that terrified her more than anything else. She tried again, but she had nothing. Lisa, watching from the sidelines, leaned in toward Marcus. "You think she's about to short-circuit?" Marcus chuckled. "Looks like it." The guests, now fully invested in the spectacle, whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads, others barely holding back their laughter. This was a moment they had all secretly wished for. The moment where someone like Karen, who had spent years treating them like outsiders in their own neighborhood, was finally being held accountable for her nonsense. Officer Diaz, still trying to process the ridiculousness of the situation, finally sighed and pulled out his notepad. "All right, well, since we got called here, we have to document this. Ma'am, can you explain, in detail, exactly what crime you believed was happening?" Karen blinked rapidly, her hands fluttering in front of her, as if she were trying to physically grasp an answer out of thin air. "Well, they were being very loud." Diaz jotted something down. Loud. What else?" Karen hesitated. "And there were so many of them." Diaz raised an eyebrow. "Oh no. A gathering. That must have been terrifying." A few guests outright cackled at that, and even Jenkins smirked before quickly wiping it off his face. Karen's frustration flared. She could feel herself losing ground, and she hated it. I was just following the rules. The HOA has noise regulations, and there are safety concerns when large groups form. It could have been a fire hazard." Derek, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. "Karen, if the biggest fire hazard here is anything, it's this dry-ass excuse you're trying to serve us." More laughter erupted, and Karen's face turned a deeper shade of red. Rick sighed, rubbing his temples. "Karen, let's be real. You called because you didn't like what you saw. You felt uncomfortable, and instead of minding your business, you made it everyone else's problem. Now, let's talk about the real issue here." He took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough for the message to hit harder. "You made a false police report. And that's an actual crime." Karen's breath caught. I didn't mean to. I thought." Rick held up a hand. "No, you didn't think. You assumed. And that assumption could have led to something serious. What if officers had shown up here thinking it was an actual threat? What if they had come in ready for a confrontation? What if someone had gotten hurt?" Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. Her excuses, her justifications, all the little things she had told herself over the years to make her feel like she wasn't the problem, were crumbling fast. Officer Jenkins, still holding his notepad, looked at Rick. "Chief, do you want us to file a report on this?" Rick studied Karen for a long moment. She was still standing stiffly, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her nails digging into her skin. He could see it, the desperation, the need to cling to whatever dignity she thought she had left. But there was also something else, a flicker of realization, even if she wasn't ready to admit it. He exhaled. "Nah. Not this time. But Karen, If you ever pull something like this again, I will personally see to it that you face consequences. Do you understand me? Karen swallowed hard and gave a stiff nod. Good. Rick turned to Jenkins and Diaz. You're dismissed. The two officers, more than ready to leave, didn't waste a second before heading back to their patrol car. As they drove away, Jenkins muttered, "That was the weirdest call I've ever been on." Diaz laughed. "And the funniest." Back in the backyard, the atmosphere shifted. The tension had evaporated, replaced with something lighter, something almost victorious. Karen, thoroughly humiliated, stood for a moment longer before finally turning and walking stiffly back to her house. The moment she closed the door behind her, a cheer went up. Derek raised his drink. To Karen for giving us the most entertaining barbecue of all time. Everyone laughed, clinking their glasses, the mood officially restored. Lisa leaned against Marcus, shaking her head. You think she learned anything? Marcus smirked. Probably not. But one thing's for sure, she ain't ever calling the cops on us again. Rick sat back down, picking up his plate. Now, can I get another plate of ribs? All that nonsense made me lose my appetite. The party roared back to life, the music blasting, the food being passed around, the energy lighter than before. Because today, for once, the script had been flipped, and it felt damn good. The air was still buzzing with the energy of what had just happened. Conversations overlapped as people reenacted Karen's stunned expression, mimicking her frantic hand gestures and exaggerated whispers of, "I don't feel safe." The laughter was infectious, spreading through the backyard like wildfire, but beneath it all was an unspoken relief. This could have gone differently. It could have been another story about a family being forced to justify their existence, another cautionary tale of what happens when the wrong people feel uncomfortable. But not today. Today, the truth had won. Marcus sat back in his chair, watching the scene unfold with a quiet satisfaction. Lisa nudged him. You really handled that well. Marcus smirked. You think I handled it? Rick's the one who served up justice with a side of barbecue sauce. Rick, licking his fingers, shrugged. Hey, I was just making sure Karen got a taste of what it's like to be on the wrong end of an unnecessary call. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. But let's be real. She's not gonna let this go. Lisa sighed. Oh, of course not. You think she's inside, reflecting on her actions? Please. She's probably drafting a Facebook post about how she was harassed in her own neighborhood. Derek snorted. Or emailing the HOA, demanding a mandatory decibel limit on human laughter. Just as he said that, the faint rustling of blinds being pulled back caught their attention. Heads turned toward Karen's house. Sure enough, through the small gap in the curtains, a pale face and a single glaring eye peeked out. Derek burst into laughter. Yo! She's watching us! Lisa waved with a big, exaggerated grin. Karen's blinds snapped shut. More laughter erupted. Marcus shook his head. She's like a cartoon villain who just got foiled but refuses to admit defeat. Rick took another bite of his ribs, speaking through a full mouth. I guarantee you she's cooking up a formal complaint right now. And he wasn't wrong. Inside her house, Karen paced back and forth, muttering under her breath, her fingers flying across her phone's screen. Her outrage had fully settled into a deep, simmering resentment. This was her neighborhood, her safe space. And now, thanks to that barbecue, thanks to that smug Chief Richardson and his little speech, thanks to all of them, she was the one being laughed at. It wasn't fair. She opened her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The HOA. Yes, that was the answer. If the police wouldn't do anything, surely the HOA would. She began to type. Subject. Urgent neighborhood concerns. Dear Homeowners Association, I am writing to formally report a situation that is deeply concerning. This afternoon, a large gathering took place in our neighborhood that disrupted the peace and created an unsafe environment for residents. There was loud music, excessive noise, and I even witnessed public alcohol consumption. Furthermore, there were individuals who seemed prepared to intimidate anyone who objected. When I attempted to address the issue, I was mocked and ridiculed in front of the entire community. This type of behavior is unacceptable and must be addressed immediately. I demand that strict noise regulations be reinforced and that a committee meeting be held to discuss proper conduct in shared spaces. I hope you take this matter seriously and act swiftly to restore order in our neighborhood. Sincerely, Karen Simmons. She hit send with a sharp click, feeling a small sense of triumph. They might have laughed today, but she would have the last word. Back at the barbecue, the party was winding down, but the energy remained high. People packed up leftovers, kids ran around with plates of watermelon, and conversations about the incident filled the air. The sun dipped lower, casting a golden glow over the gathering. Then, as expected, Marcus' phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and let out a low chuckle. And there it is. Lisa leaned in. Let me guess. Hoa. Marcus nodded. Yup. Emergency meeting scheduled for Monday. Derek rolled his eyes. She wasted no time, huh? Rick sighed, setting down his plate. I better come to that meeting. This woman is determined. Monday came faster than expected. The HOA meeting was held in the community center, and sure enough, Karen was seated front and center, her arms folded, her expression tight with self-righteous indignation. Other homeowners trickled in, most looking confused, some already smirking. Word had spread. They knew exactly why they were here. Marcus, Lisa, Derek, and a few other barbecue guests arrived together, their expressions calm but ready. Rick walked in last, still in uniform, and Karen stiffened at the sight of him. The HLA president, Mr. Holloway, an elderly man who had been forced to deal with Karen's complaints for years, sighed as he took his seat. All right, folks. We've received a complaint about a disturbance in the neighborhood, so let's get straight to it. Karen wasted no time. She shot to her feet, clutching a folder of printed emails and note. Mr. Holloway, this isn't just about one incident. This is about a pattern of behavior that is disrupting our community. It started with one barbecue, but what happens next? House parties? Strangers coming in and out at all hours? We need rules. We need structure. Holloway pinched the bridge of his nose. Karen, it was a backyard barbecue. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. Rules are rules. We have noise ordinances. We have regulations. Rick cleared his throat, leaning forward. Karen, let's be real here. You didn't call because of noise. You called because you didn't like the people at the barbecue. And now, instead of admitting you overreacted, you're trying to turn this into a policy issue. Karen's face flushed. That is not true. I have always advocated for order and safety in this community. Marcus finally spoke. Then where was all this energy when Mr. Davidson had his 4th of July fireworks show that went on until midnight? Or when the Hendersons threw that St. Patrick's Day bash with a live band? Or when you hosted your own wine and cheese night that lasted until 2 in the morning? The room went silent. Several attendees nodded, remembering those very incidents. Karen's face twitched. That's different. Lisa folded her arms. How? Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. Holloway sighed deeply. All right, I think we've heard enough. No rules were broken. This was an unnecessary complaint. This meeting is over. Karen's mouth opened in protest, but no one was listening anymore. People were already standing, shaking hands, chatting among themselves. She was officially dismissed. As Marcus, Lisa, and the others walked out, Derek shook his head. Man, that was the easiest win of all time. Rick smirked. Karen's got a talent for making herself look bad. Marcus exhaled, a small smile playing on his lips. She wanted the cops to come down on us. Instead, she got exactly what she deserved. Lisa squeezed his hand. And the best part? She knows it. As they stepped outside, Karen stood alone in the parking lot, gripping her folder tightly, watching as her neighbors walked away, laughing, united in something she had tried to destroy. She had lost. And worse, she knew it. A year had passed since the infamous barbecue incident, and things in the neighborhood had settled into an uneasy normalcy. Karen, much to her own dismay, had become something of a local legend. People still whispered about it at community gatherings, exchanging knowing glances whenever she walked by. The nickname Barbecue Karen had stuck, much to her frustration, and her attempts to reframe the narrative had all but failed. No one had forgotten the day she called the cops on the police chief at a family barbecue. Marcus had moved on, as had everyone else. The summer was back again, and as tradition demanded, the Johnsons were firing up the grill for another cookout. The air was rich with the scent of smoked ribs, burgers sizzling on the grill, and the unmistakable crackle of laughter echoing across the yard. It was as if last year's drama had never happened, except for the occasional joke at Karen's expense, which still got people chuckling every now and then. Lisa, setting down a tray of freshly made cornbread, glanced across the street. "You see what I see?" Marcus turned, following her gaze. There, standing hesitantly on her porch, was Karen. But something was different. She wasn't scowling. She wasn't glaring with her arms crossed. She wasn't even on her phone, preparing to dial 911. She was just standing there, watching. Derek, who had been halfway through biting into a chicken leg, snorted. "Oh Lord! What does she want now? She about to serve us with a cease and desist for having fun?" Lisa shook her head, intrigued. "No, look at her. She looks unsure." And she did. Karen, normally so firm in her convictions, so rigid in her disapproval, seemed hesitant, almost awkward. Marcus exhaled. "I guess it was bound to happen." Derek raised an eyebrow. "What, she finally ran out of people to call the cops on?" Marcus ignored him and walked over to the fence, calling out, "Hey, Karen!" She startled slightly, as if she hadn't expected to be noticed so soon. Her fingers clutched something in her hands, Tupperware. Marcus squinted. Was she holding a dish? Karen cleared her throat, shifting awkwardly. I made something." Derek leaned over to whisper to Lisa. "If she pulls out a tuna casserole, I'm leaving." Lisa nudged him. "Be nice." Marcus, ever the diplomat, kept his expression neutral. "That right? What'd you bring?" Karen hesitated before stepping forward and holding out the container. "Potato salad." Silence fell. Every black person in that backyard simultaneously felt a deep, instinctive sense of caution. Lisa's smile tightened. "Potato salad?" Karen nodded, nervously. "Yes. I figured since I always see you guys out here having these get-togethers, maybe I could contribute something." Derek, unable to resist, murmured, "If this got raisins in it, I swear to God." Karen, picking up on the skepticism, rushed to clarify. "No raisins. Just potatoes, mayonnaise, a little mustard, some seasoning," she trailed off, suddenly self-conscious. Marcus took the container from her hands, looking at it like it might explode. "Well, that's, thoughtful of you." Karen nodded, then hesitated again. "I know I haven't exactly been neighborly." Lisa arched an eyebrow. "You called the cops on a family barbecue." Karen winced. "Right, yes. That was a mistake." Derek smirked. "A historical mistake." Karen sighed. "I get it, okay? I deserved that. But I guess I just wanted to say, in my own way, that I'm sorry." This was a moment none of them had anticipated. Karen Simmons, the same woman who had spent years side-eyeing them from across the street, who had single-handedly made an entire police department question their priorities, was now standing here, offering a dish as a form of penance. Marcus exhaled, glancing at Lisa. She gave him a small nod. "Well," Marcus said finally, setting the container down on the table, "you might as well stay and see if anyone survives eating it." Karen blinked. "Wait, you mean?" Lisa smiled. "Might as well pull up a chair." Karen hesitated, then, realizing the offer was genuine, nodded quickly. She stepped cautiously onto the lawn, as if waiting for someone to revoke the invitation. But no one did. A few of the neighbors shot each other looks, still wary, but no one objected. If Marcus and Lisa were willing to let her sit, then the rest would go along with it, at least for now. Karen sat, her hands folded in her lap, looking uncertain. Someone passed her a plate. She blinked, then slowly started serving herself. For the first time, she wasn't an observer or an antagonist. She was just a neighbor, sitting among the very people she once feared. Derek leaned toward Marcus. If this is a redemption arc, it's the weirdest one I've ever seen. Marcus chuckled. Yeah, well, people can surprise you. And just like that, the music continued, the food was shared, and the past, though not entirely forgotten, took a back seat to the present. Karen was still Karen, and no one expected miracles. But for the first time she was trying. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.